Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Unbound Season 3, The Other Side of Quiet. In today's episode, I am reading a chapter that kind of captures one of those rare turning points in life. I'd say it's the kind you really only recognize in hindsight. You know, this is the moment when the entire trajectory of my future shifted. Quietly, unexpectedly, but completely. This is chapter 13 in the book. Everything Changes. October 26, 1996. I remember the date because it was the day my entire life changed direction, even though I had no idea that's what was happening at the time. I was 21 years old, cautiously optimistic about the future for the first time in years, and completely unprepared for the way love could sneak up on you when you weren't looking for it. Nate and I had spent the summer making careful plans. We'd talked through our trauma, our grief, our shared loss. We'd agreed to try again, really try this time, not the complicated dance we've been doing for years, but an actual relationship built on who we'd become, rather than who we'd been before everything went wrong. I'd finally started to believe that maybe I could have the love story I'd always wanted with the person who'd seen me at my worst and still thought I was worth fighting for. And then I met up with Brian in person, and everything I thought I knew about my own heart became irrelevant. It was almost Halloween, and Kelly, Sally, my sister, and I had planned to go on one of those haunted hay rides that pop up everywhere in late October. It was exactly the kind of silly, seasonal fun I needed. An excuse to scream and laugh and act like a normal 21-year-old instead of someone carrying the weight of more trauma than most people experience in a lifetime. We piled into my car, armed with hot chocolate and the kind of giddy excitement that comes from deliberately seeking out harmless scares. The long drive was fun, but the hayride was nothing it was supposed to be because it never happened. The line was so long we decided to bail. For those few hours, though, I felt lighter than I had in years. I felt like the version of myself that might have existed if trauma hadn't carved me into something different. When we were walking back to the car, still laughing about nothing in particular, I told them I had plans to meet someone. One of the girls, I don't recall which, was instantly curious in the way friends always are about potential romantic developments. I kept it vague. A guy named Brian, someone I'd talked to on the phone. "Wait, who is this guy?" she asked from the passenger seat. "Just someone a friend set me up with," I lied, trying to sound casual. "We talked on the phone last week." In my head, I kept hearing, "What about Nate?" The question hung in the air. "It's complicated," I thought to myself, which was the understatement of the century. My sister gave me a look that said we'd been talking about this guy later, but she didn't push. Maybe she could sense I was already confused enough without having to explain it to everyone else. I nodded and laughed along with the conversation, but I wasn't listening. I was already thinking about what I'd wear, how I'd do my hair, whether Brian would be as easy to talk to in person as he'd been on the phone. I was already gone, even though I hadn't admitted it to myself yet. I think my friends were excited for me in that hopeful way people get when they think you might be about to find happiness. I should have gone home with them. I should have called it a perfect night and headed back to the safety of my parents' house. Instead, I drove out to meet Brian with butterflies in my stomach and no idea that I was about to spend the evening with the person I'd spend the rest of my life with. The place was packed with people in Halloween costumes, vampires and zombies and slutty cats everywhere. The music was too loud, the air smelled like beer and body odor, and I almost turned around and left. Because how were we supposed to have a conversation in this chaos? Then I saw him standing near the bar, and he smiled when he saw me. He was taller than I'd expected. Not Nate tall, but tall enough. Long blonde hair, nice eyes, dressed like a normal person who wasn't trying too hard. "Beth?" he said, and his voice was the same as it had been on the phone, warm, easy, like we were already friends. "Brian," I said, and suddenly the butterflies in my stomach weren't just nerves anymore. They were anticipation. The first thing I noticed was how comfortable he looked. Not nervous or trying too hard or checking his watch, just settled into the moment like he belonged wherever he was. We found a table in the corner away from the Halloween crowd and started talking. And just like on the phone, it was easy. Effortless in a way that felt almost magical after years of relationships that required constant work and careful navigation. He told me about his job and his family. I told him about my job, about trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, about feeling like I was finally starting to come back to myself after a long period of feeling lost. I had already enrolled in the police sciences course offered at the same university Nate was at. I didn't tell him about Brandon or about Kier or about the complicated situation with Nate. Those stories felt too heavy for a first meeting, too much to unload on someone who was still essentially a stranger. When he asked if I was dating anyone, I said it's complicated and changed the subject. When he asked if I'd always wanted to work with kids, I said sort of, and didn't mention that I'd once been pregnant, that I held my dead son in my arms, that I was trying to heal a wound he couldn't see. When he asked what kind of a relationship I was looking for, I said I'm not sure. Instead of I'm supposed to be getting back together with my ex, but sitting here with you is making me question everything. I was lying by omission, and I knew it. But the lies felt like protection. Protection for him from the weight of my past. Protection for me from having to watch another person decide whether my damage was worth dealing with. With Brian, I could be the version of myself that might have existed if trauma hadn't happened. And that felt like a gift I wasn't ready to refuse. But somehow, without sharing the specifics, I found myself being more honest with Brian than I'd been with anyone in months. When he asked about my future plans, I admitted I wasn't really sure what I was doing with my life, that I felt like I was still figuring out who I was after some difficult stuff. He didn't try to fix me or give me advice or convince me everything happens for a reason. He just accepted what I told him and made space for the uncertainty I was carrying. It was a small thing, but it felt revolutionary. It reminded me of that earlier season when I first met Nate. At some point during the night, maybe around hour 2, Brian was telling me a story, something silly, and I realized I was smiling. Not the fake smile I'd gotten so good at, not the careful smile I used with Nate when I didn't want him to see how much pain I was still in. A real smile. The kind that starts in your chest and spreads to your face without you deciding to put it there. And I thought, this is what it feels like to be with someone who doesn't know all your sad stories. Someone who looks at you and sees possibility instead of damage. Someone who makes you feel light instead of heavy. That's when I knew I was in trouble. Not because Brian was perfect. I barely knew him, but because for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. We talked until the bar started closing down around us, until the Halloween crowd had thinned out and the bartender was giving us looks that suggested we should probably think about wrapping things up. I should probably get going, I said, though I didn't want to. I could have talked to Brian for another 3 hours without getting bored or running out of things to say. Yeah, me too, he said, but he didn't move to get up either. We sat there for another few minutes, neither of us quite ready to end whatever this was. I had a really good time tonight, he said finally. Me too, I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. Can I call you? He asked. I mean, I know we already talked on the phone, but I'd like to see you again, if you want to. I should have said I needed to think about it. Should have mentioned that my situation was complicated, that there was someone else I'd been planning a future with, but I wasn't really available in the way he probably thought I was. Instead, I heard myself saying, I'd like that. He walked me to my car, and when we got there, he didn't try to kiss me or push for more than anything the evening had naturally provided. He just said goodnight and waited until I was safely in my car before walking to his own. It was such a small gesture of consideration, but after years of dating men who seemed to think politeness was optional, it stood out. The drive home should have given me time to think, to process what had just happened, to figure out what this meant for the plans I'd been making with Nate. Instead, I found myself replaying the conversation, remembering the way Brian had laughed at my jokes, the way he'd listened when I talked, the way being with him had felt natural in a way I hadn't experienced with anyone else. But instead of thinking clearly, my mind was a mess of competing thoughts. I should call Nate right now. I should tell him what happened. I should be honest. But what would I even say? Hey, I just had an amazing time with another guy and I'm not sure about us anymore? After everything we'd been through, after all the plans we made? I thought about the lake, about sitting on that bench in July, about Nate saying I don't want to pretend Kier didn't exist. And then I thought about Brian's laugh and the way he'd looked at me, like I was interesting. About how easy it had been to just be myself without carrying the weight of everything that had happened. I thought about Kier, about whether choosing Brian meant somehow betraying our son's memory, about whether I was supposed to end up with Nate because we'd shared that loss, or whether I was allowed to choose someone who represented a future without that grief. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, I still didn't have any answers. But I knew one thing. I wanted to see Brian again. And that want felt bigger than any logic or obligation or plan I'd made. When I got home, there was a message from Nate on my answering machine. "Hey, it's me. Just wanted to see how your night at the hayride went. Call me tomorrow?" I hated mirrors, but I stared at myself and the wall of mirrors I had in my bedroom for a long time, knowing I should call him back, should tell him about meeting Brian, should figure out what all this meant before it got more complicated than it already was. I played his message 3 times, listening to the hope in his voice. Call me tomorrow? Tomorrow, like we had all the time in the world, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and he didn't know it yet. I looked at myself in the mirror, really looked, and barely recognized the person staring back. She looked lighter somehow, younger, like she'd spent the evening being someone other than the girl who lost a baby and pushed everyone who loved her away. I'd spent 2 years trying to become someone Nate could love again. At least that's what I thought. He hadn't stopped. But maybe I'd just met someone who could love the person I actually was. What I didn't realize then was that was also Nate. I erased the message without calling him back. It was a coward's move, and I damn well knew it. But I wasn't ready to choose yet. Wasn't ready to hurt him. Wasn't ready to walk away from everything we'd been building back toward. So I chose delay instead of honesty. It was the first in a series of choices that would lead me away from Nate and toward the life I was actually supposed to live. But that night, I just went to sleep thinking about Brian's smile and pretending I didn't know what I was doing. Because somewhere between the haunted hayride and the conversation at the bar, between Brian's easy laughter and his genuine interest in what I had to say, I'd realized something that had changed everything. For the first time in my adult life, the first time since meeting Nate as a teen, I'd met someone who made me curious about a future I'd never imagined. And curiosity was a much more powerful force than obligation or history or even love that was built on shared trauma. I'd spent years fighting and trying to rebuild something with Nate that was based on who we'd been before everything went wrong. But maybe what I actually needed was to build something new with someone who only knew who I was now. Maybe the love I'd been trying so hard to resurrect wasn't the love I was supposed to have. Maybe it was time to stop looking backward and start looking forward. I knew I'd have to tell Nate eventually. I knew I couldn't keep seeing Brian while letting Nate think we were still planning a future together. But eventually felt far away, and right now felt too hard. So I gave myself permission to be curious just a little longer, to see where this thing with Brian might go before I burned down everything I'd been building with Nate. It was selfish. It was cruel. But trauma had taught me to protect myself first, and honesty felt too dangerous when I wasn't sure what I was being honest about yet. I'd figure it out tomorrow. Tomorrow I'd be brave. But tomorrow never came quite when I expected it to. When I look back on that night now, what stands out most isn't the choice I had made yet. It's how quietly my body already knew. Change didn't arrive with fireworks or certainty. It showed up as ease, as lightness, right? As this kind of unfamiliar feeling of not bracing for impact. I was only 21, right? So I didn't have language for that. I only knew that being with Brian felt different in a way that I couldn't really explain without betraying someone I loved. I'd spent so long living inside my grief and responsibility that I didn't recognize calm as information. I thought love was supposed to feel heavy and earned and paid for in endurance. What I felt that night wasn't intensity. It was like friggin' oxygen. This chapter isn't really about choosing between Nate and Brian. That framing is just far too fucking simple and honestly too unfair to all 3 of us. What was actually happening was that I was standing between 2 selves. One version of me was built entirely around survival, loyal, careful, trauma bonded, carrying history like a vow, basically. And, that version knew how to endure. And the other version was just beginning to surface, a version of me who wasn't orienting every choice around loss, who could imagine a future that didn't revolve around repairing the past. Loving Nate required so much presence and so much emotional labor and so much bravery. We shared a language of grief that no one else spoke. There was a depth there and a truth and a real love that still remains today. But there was also a weight I'd been carrying for years. The sense that staying meant staying inside the worst thing that had ever happened to us. And, I didn't want to abandon that love, but I also didn't know how to keep living inside of it, if that makes sense. What Brian offered that night wasn't a promise or a plan. It was something smaller and much more destabilizing. He met me without context, without expectation and without needing to understand my pain. In order to care about me, I didn't have to perform healing or explain scars. I could just exist. And for someone who'd spent years being defined by loss, that felt pretty friggin' radical. And there's this kind of kindness that feels almost suspicious when you're traumatized. When someone listens without probing, when they don't try to fix you or extract a story from you, when they accept, I don't know, as a complete answer. I didn't trust it at first, but my body responded anyway. I smiled without effort and I breathed without thinking about it and I stayed present instead of dissociating. That was new. At least it was new for the first time in a long time because it was very similar to how Nate was in the beginning with me. These two men, so different from each other, but so the same for me, if that makes sense. I want to be honest about something here. I didn't handle this moment well. I chose delay instead of clarity, and I chose silence instead of honesty. And I convinced myself I was protecting Nate when really I was just protecting myself from having to admit that something had shifted. I wasn't ready to hurt him. I also wasn't ready to deny what I felt. So I kind of hovered in between, and people get hurt in the in-between. It would be easy to judge that version of me, to call her selfish or cowardly. But when I look at her now, I see a young woman who had spent years being loyal to grief and had no idea how to be loyal to herself without feeling like she was doing something wrong. Trauma had taught me that desire was dangerous and curiosity led to loss, and wanting more meant betraying what I had already survived. That night, though, cracked that belief open, not because Brian was the answer, because I still didn't really know it, but because he represented a future that wasn't built on shared trauma. And he didn't know the girl I used to be or the worst thing that ever happened to me. He only knew the person sitting across from him, and he liked her. And that mattered more than I understood at the time. What I didn't realize then was that curiosity isn't reckless. It's information. It's the nervous system saying, something here feels possible. For years, my choices had been driven by obligation, by history and loyalty and fear of doing harm. And curiosity was new and curiosity was alive. And once it showed up, I couldn't unfeel it. This chapter kind of marks the moment I stopped trying to resurrect a life that existed before trauma, and I started very tentatively imagining one that came after it. I didn't make the right choice that night. I didn't make a clean choice at all. What I actually did was notice that I was changing, that I was allowed to want something different, and that survival didn't have to be the only story I told about myself. If you've ever found yourself standing at the edge of a choice you don't feel ready to name, kind of torn between loyalty and truth or between history and possibility, I want you to know that hesitation doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human. Growth rarely looks noble when it's happening. Sometimes it looks like confusion, sometimes it looks like delay, and sometimes it looks like a single evening that rearranges your internal world before you have the courage to rearrange your life, if that makes sense. That night didn't come with answers. It came with curiosity. And eventually I would learn that curiosity is often the first breath of a life that's trying to begin. Sometimes the turning point doesn't ask your permission. It just waits for you to notice that you're no longer the same. Thank you so much for being here. Please make sure to follow me wherever you listen to me, so when new episodes come out, you'll be notified. Remember that all episodes of Unbound are free. If you want to support the production costs, you can find me on Ko-fi, but there's never any obligation. All the support and contact info is in the show notes. Join the Facebook group. We sometimes have further discussion there, and I will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author.bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/unbound podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.